Hello, I'm Rachel Gilmore, your least favorite person's least favorite journalist. Welcome to Bubble Pop. This is the live show where we talk about some of the biggest headlines and juiciest news tidbits so you don't have to doom scroll. Just a reminder that if you want to support the show, you can subscribe on Patreon, Substack, and YouTube, as well as anywhere that you like to listen. And while we're live, we like to leave about 10 minutes at the end of the interview to take some audience questions. We'll prioritize super chats, so if you want to drop one of those, know that there's a much higher likelihood of us getting to your questions, but we are a democracy here. We don't want the wealthy to be the only ones able to ask questions. So we do pretty much always take some regular questions as well. So let's get into it. It has been a tough couple of weeks. Armed thugs are gunning down protesters in broad daylight on American streets, and the administration has been lying to the public to defend those executions. It's raised a lot of questions for me, both as a Canadian who's trying to avoid our bad habit of copying what the US does first, and also as a human being just trying to understand how people can be so cruel and do evil things to each other. So when I saw Dr. Yannick Veilleux-Lepage's post on Bluesky, it struck a chord with me. He asked, how do seemingly ordinary people become agents of state murder? Then he posted a whole thread of various great thinkers, academics, and more who have grappled with that very question. So it's one that I want to grapple with now too. So I asked Yannick to join me on the show to help me do it. Dr. Yannick Veilleux-Lepage is a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada. He's an expert on tech, far-right extremism, and terrorism tactics. And I am really hoping that he can help us to at least try to make sense of these really senseless times. Or at least we'll talk about it all. So Yannick, welcome to Bubble Pop.
Thanks for having me, Rachel. It's very exciting to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you. When I saw that thread, it just really struck me. And I don't know, because I think that is the overarching feeling that a lot of people have when they're watching these horrors is, how can people do this? Like, it makes you question, is there like a critical mass of evil people in the world, or do good people sometimes do bad things? So I wanted to ask you, like, as someone who studies these issues, were you surprised when ICE agents started actually killing protesters, and why or why not?
So I wasn't surprised in kind of a structural or analytical sense, but I was still deeply disturbed by what I saw. Part of the reason why I'm not surprised by this, if you take an institution like ICE, its everyday mandate involves violence and coercion. It involves surveillance. It involves detention, forcible removal. We've seen, for example, the deportee flights to El Salvador's. And then if you place these individuals in this institution in a kind of like highly politicized street context, and in particular a context that's framed by the media, but also the Trump administration as a context of disorder and threat, there's really the conditions for lethal escalation. And this is, I think, what we saw. One of the things I was kind of trying to really bring forward with this thread is that it's not about individual malice. And I think there is often a desire to attribute blame to one particular individual. But rather it's about, institutional logics. It's about how enforcement cultures can interact with these different pressures, and also about ambiguity. And this is really one of the central questions that exists within the broader literature on state violence, but also on genocide. And I teach a graduate course at the Royal Military College on genocide, comparative genocide. And this is essentially this question of how is it that ordinary people end up doing these things that seem absolutely extraordinary. It seems outside the norm of what we believe is capable. And this is what I kind of try to get my students to think about, but also my followers on Bluesky and your audience, is that even before somebody pulls a trigger or or pepper sprays someone, or batons someone. There's procedures, there's mandates, there's chains of command, there's narratives about targeting, and all these things are going to shape how agents see the situation and how they think about what their role is and what the people they interact with role are, and whether they are perceived as threats. So, when we think about violence, we need to think about the people inside the system, but we also need to kind of emphasize that it's not, the blame cannot be attributed to one individual, but rather we need to kind of look at this through like a systemic level. And this is one of the things that I think is missing in a lot of analysis about the violence that's occurring during Operation Metro Surge, is this kind of broad systemic understanding of how bureaucratic processes are enabling and this violence, unfortunately. So, like, to answer your question, I'm not surprised in an analytical sense, but seeing the reality of the killing of Rene Good or Alex Preti, it remains deeply shocking.
Yeah, no, it's I can't help but wonder, and I'm sure we'll get into a lot of this over the course of the conversation, but it just immediately struck me when you were giving that answer. I feel like in telling ourselves that it's a unique bad actor, someone who has something wrong with their brain or is, uniquely cruel in some way, it makes us feel as though we would never do that. It's a comforting thought that if the conditions were right, that we know that we wouldn't behave that way. And I think that if anything, that's a dangerous line of thinking, because it prevents you from inoculating yourself from the conditions that could then make you into an agent of state violence, if not murder. But I wanted to drill down on your thread and the posts that I saw that originally prompted me to reach out to you for this episode. As I mentioned in the introduction, you asked, how do seemingly ordinary people become agents of state murder? And while some of the authors that you cite throughout this thread, they detail different explanations for this, there are definitely some themes that are woven throughout. And one of those, as you mentioned in your initial answer a little bit, is just the banality of it all. I mean, I think that a lot of people have heard that phrase from Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil. The element, as you mentioned, of bureaucratic routine. So I wanted to ask you if you could explain a little bit more and just kind of expand on what you mentioned about how the ordinariness of evil acts plays such a significant role in producing state murder.
Yeah. So ordinariness really is important to this conversation. And the reason why it's important is that it explains scale, right? If mass violence or state violence required, sociopath or psychopath or kind of serial killers that found their calling working within these institutions, state violence would be rare. It would be very rare, right? But history actually shows us that state killings are carried out often, and they're carried out by ordinary people. And this is the insight, as you mentioned, it's often attributed to Hannah Arendt and her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. Just to give a bit of context on this book, because it's extremely important. Eichmann was one of the principal architects of the Holocaust. After the fall of the Third Reich, he escapes through rat lines and ends up working in a car factory in Argentina. Eventually, Israeli intelligence gets essentially a tip-off saying that kind of one of the most high-ranking remaining free Nazi is in Argentina, and they send a snatch team made up of Mossad and Shin Bet. They identify him, and then they essentially kidnap him. They force him to drink a bottle. I think it was whiskey or scotch. I don't quite know.
Oh, really?
But essentially, they get him properly shit-faced. They put him into an El Al uniform, so the Israeli airline, and they essentially just kind of carry him onto an Israeli or an El Al flight, commercial flight, as a drunk pilot, and then they bring him back to Israel, where he's put to stand trial. And there's a lot of questions as well as to like whether somebody like that even deserves a trial, but the decision is made to make him stand trial. And this ends up being like an extremely important media event. This is 1961, so it's 15 years after the end of the Second World War. A lot of people have kind of moved on to other topics. It's not I think kind of like there's a collective trauma, right? We're talking about not only the Holocaust, but also a war that has killed tens of millions of civilians, has created deep scars, and there's I think a collective desire for people to kind of move on and talk about other things. The Eichmann trial essentially brings back the Holocaust as a topic of kind of dinner table conversation. Okay, so with that, Arendt goes to Jerusalem and she observes the trial. She's reporting for the magazine The New Yorker. And she later writes a book, and in which essentially she says that she's not struck by Eichmann's like cruelty or even his like profound devotion to National Socialism, but rather about kind of like how boring and ordinary he seemed. He spoke in cliche. He was fixated on like procedures. He described his action in kind of like a boring administrative task, rather than talking about like moral decisions and dilemmas and conundrums. So essentially what she argues, it's not that he's innocent, but rather she's very, very clear in her text that he is guilty of perpetrating this horrendous crime. But rather, she argues that the evil is present in this kind of modern bureaucratic system doesn't require sadism or like deep ideological hatred. It just requires people to stop thinking morally and instead start thinking about like rules and procedures and also careerism and career survival.
Yeah,
I think this is super useful today. I think if there's one book that I recommended, this is probably the one I would say is the starting point. It's probably one of the most important one in these kind of like micro approach to genocide. So essentially micro, I mean the study of the individual perpetrator. And it's useful when we start thinking about ICE agents in Minnesota, right? I think it's, as I said, it's easy for us to demonize them. It's easy for us to think that they are personally cruel, that they enjoy ripping children away from parents and all these things that we often see as cliches. But I think a much more convincing explanation as to why we are seeing this on kind of large scale is because of the institutions. The institutions that allow actors to see themselves essentially as functionary of a broad system, and that essentially removes kind of moral hesitation. There's another fantastic book that I mentioned, if you'll indulge me in this.
Yeah, of course.
And this is Christopher Browning's Ordinary Man. And I think the parallel here is so striking. So essentially Browning is an historian, and he studied a reserve police regiment, a reserve German police regiment that was active in Poland in 1942. This regiment is mostly made up of middle-aged men, often veterans from the First World War. And essentially they're not, in Browning's telling, they're not ideological extremists. But nonetheless, the battalion does commit massacres. It commits mass shooting. It rounds up Jews for deportation to Nazi extermination camp. And essentially his argument is that these people became mass shooters, became agent of death through peer pressure, through obedience, through societal and situational escalation. Essentially the fear of kind of sticking out from this group, from their peer, motivated them to continue in these acts of violence. And I think, again, this is one of the plays where we can draw a very interesting parallel where it's easy to try to focus on the individuals, but we also need to kind of start focusing about how ICE as a culture, as an institution, with rituals, with pageantry, right? They're dressed a certain way. They talk a certain way. They're wearing gear that is not necessarily standard issue. They're covering their face. They're wearing sunglasses. how that creates social cohesion within ICE agent, and then somebody saying like, "Whoa, guys, slow down," or "This is excessive force," or "This is not actually our mandate." That essentially gets pushed down by this desire to be part of this team and the fear of kind of in-group retribution.
It's so interesting. It's scary when you think about it. I mean, one thing that struck me when I was watching a little YouTube summary of that book, Ordinary Men, because I'm an excellent student, and I heard in it that these men also didn't have to do all the things. Like not everything. They were given a choice in some instances of whether to shoot people or not. Like they didn't have to be in the firing squads, and they didn't, and they chose to do that. And these were, as the title of the book alludes to, ordinary men. And you can correct me if I'm mistaken about that based on my little YouTube research, but I found that really shocking because it does kind of complicate those notions that there's a uniqueness to the kinds of people capable of doing these things, and forces us to ask ourselves some uncomfortable things about how easily we can be swayed in those situations as a result of peer pressure, careerism, and ordinariness. And I wanted to drill down a little bit more on the first half of what you were describing there, which is that the banality, the ordinariness. I was hoping you could tell me a little bit more about how these evil acts become seen as ordinary. Like, is there a specific process to it that we see happening again and again? Is it a variety of ways? Like, is it just they make it boring? I mean, frankly, this is a little bit of a tangent, but as someone working in media, I've noticed how quickly folks become desensitized to issues. And I've also noticed the power of, for example, I did a story on the companies who are profiting from ICE's, mass deportations, and just the numbers and the paperwork and the boring graphs and the government procurement documents. Like, it's boring as hell. And I think that makes it easy to turn your brain off and dehumanize an element of what is actually being done with that paperwork, with that money, with those contracts. So I guess I wanted to ask you, like, how do we get there where someone like Eichmann is a key player in the Holocaust when he, as he said, never killed anyone himself? How does that become normal?
That's a great question. And I mean, the answer is it's complicated. But if I was to kind of try to break it down into kind of three main processes or mechanisms that I think we can see. The first one has to do with like a shift in agency and the absorption of authority. And this is where like Stanley Milgram's experiment often come up in these conversations. So for those who might not be familiar with Milgram, essentially he did an experiment trying to essentially answer this question, but he recruited a bunch of subjects, and they were essentially told that they were doing experiment based on learning. And so there's an individual, essentially an actor, who's playing the role as the subject of the experiment, where in reality the subject of the experiment is the administrator of the test. So these administrators of the test, which are recruited, are essentially told, we're going to ask these questions to this actor, and when he gets it wrong, administer an electric shock, and we're going to see whether or not this essentially improves somebody's ability to learn. Now, as the test progressed, the shocks are said to go greater and greater and greater, and start approaching kind of lethal amount. Now, in reality, the actor is not really getting shocked. But essentially what this experiment has showed us is that in a setting where there's, somebody in a lab coat, somebody with a seemingly an authority, a professor or a social psychologist, and is instructing the subject to keep shocking the actor, or the student, if you will, most people simply obeyed. And if you go on YouTube, you can essentially see these videos of the experiment where people are saying like, well, I don't know if I should do more. And then the administrator of the test being like, no, you have to continue. We can't stop this test. So essentially what he found, right, is this notion of shift in agency. People, while the participant were distressed, continued because it was their responsibility rested with the authority and not with them. So the moral question kind of shifted from, is this right, to am I doing this correctly? And the psychological shift, I think, is crucial because it shows us how, when moral agency is kind of handed upwards, violence can become routine for the individual. So again, like if we bring this back to what's happening in Minnesota, ICE agents have been told that they are acting under legal authority. Stephen Miller essentially told them that they had complete immunity. They are told that they are doing this for national security and that their work is essential. So therefore, the psychological burden of the decision making is shifted upwards. And in the protest environment in Minnesota, where there's ambiguity and high stress, this shift becomes even more pronounced.
Yannick,
Yeah.
I think I don't know if this is coming through for everyone or if it's just my AirPods, but there's a bit of a issue with the mic. I don't know if you could maybe just unplug it and plug it back in just to see if that fixes it.
I can try. I'm also going to go close my door because I've just heard my toddler come back in. And does this work? Is that better?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay.
That's perfect.
So I'm having a bit of a perfect storm. I have the city of Kingston literally cutting a tree down in front of my house, and I have a sick toddler downstairs. So I do apologize.
Oh, no, don't apologize at all. It's, you know what? We are ordinary men, as they say, right? So it's there are life things happening around us. So anyways, thank you so much for just adjusting that. But so you were just talking about the Milgram experiment and how these people, diffuse.
So that's one of the processes, right? Essentially, you're able to shift moral responsibility upwards, and then therefore you're not essentially concerning yourself as whether or not you are responsible for these actions, because you have been told by the vice president, the president, the head of DHS, by a special advisor to the president, that what you are doing is not only lawful, it is also essential. The second shift that we see is essentially this notion, and this comes out of a fantastic book by Bauman called Modernity and the Holocaust. And essentially his argument here is that the Holocaust is not a product of the breakdown of modern society, but rather is a byproduct of modern society. And his central claim is that the Holocaust could never have taken place if it wasn't for all the tools of bureaucracy. And what we mean by this, rational planning, division of labor, supply chain, weaponization of technology, IBM counting machines, and so on. So essentially, his argument here is that bureaucracy makes violence efficient and psychologically manageable. So the argument here is that individuals are assigned specific narrow tasks, and these are evaluated on technical performance, and therefore they're shielded from the overall outcome, right? So if you take, for example, kind of what we are seeing here, in Minnesota, you've got various individuals who all have different roles to play in this. And I think this kind of goes back to your reporting yesterday on the Canadian contracts when it comes to ICE, right? So the individual who is building a vehicle that is going to be sold to ICE does not see himself, or probably doesn't see himself, as having a moral responsibility for what's happening in Minnesota. The sale agent who who sold that contract or created that contract doesn't see, is not the one who pulled the trigger. And we can kind of keep going on. So essentially what we're seeing here is that responsibility ends up being diffused amongst dozens, hundreds, thousands of individuals. And then the last aspect is really this notion of like peer belonging and particular peer enforcement. I've talked about Browning, and I, again, this kind of goes back to belonging because as a form of pressure, right? Like once violence is normalized within a group, the absence of that violence, abstaining from that violence, essentially starts feeling like a betrayal or a weakness to the group you're participating in. So, if you've got an ICE agent and you've got somebody who's much more restrained, how are his colleagues going to see this individuals? And essentially, is it simply going to be like, he doesn't have our back? He is not willing to do what he needs to do in order to protect us. So violence becomes something that we do, as opposed to something that I do or I choose to do. This is, these are the three processes that I think help us understand what's happening here.
Yeah. So I find the peer pressure aspect really interesting. I mean, yeah, it makes it feel so frightening because I think everyone can think of situations, particularly when they're a teenager or if they're working in an office where maybe things are normalized. I mean, even again, working in media, just like the desensitization that you have to have because there's just so much traumatic information coming in at all times. So you just focus on your job. And if you're not able to just swallow the traumatic information coming in, you're maybe not seen as tough, right? And could you speak a little bit more to how like peer pressure has shaped what we're seeing here? I mean, I think you did a pretty good job just going over it now, but if you can dig into it anymore, I just think it's so fascinating.
So like as I was saying, right? So like violence becomes a group norm. Violence is something that essentially becomes the accepted modus operandi of how a group behaves and carries out their duty. And I think we see this with like just the sheer level of aggression that ICE agents are engaging and are using when they're engaging with the public. And we saw this particularly in the killing of Alex Preti, but it doesn't even have to go to the point where someone is killed, right? There's hundreds of videos by bystanders, by citizens of Minneapolis, and that essentially shows these extremely unorthodox and extremely aggressive interaction that seems completely out of the ordinary, right? Like if a cop behaved that way, it wouldn't be tolerated. So this is one aspect of it, but essentially what ends up happening is that opting out of this MO and this behavior risks isolating the individual or bringing him shame, or even being seen as disloyal or not trustworthy, or not kind of having the back of his comrade. And over time, this becomes the standard practice. And belonging essentially becomes more important than moral hesitation. It also becomes quite important when that group is seen as being kind of targeted and ostracized, right? So like ICE agents have really brought about this narrative that they are under threat. They're covering their faces because they are at risk of being doxxed. They're at risk of their neighbors, right? So we know that the individual who killed Rene Good had told his neighbor that I believe he was a florist. I think that was his kind of cover story. So you then have this kind of sense of belonging. It's even that's even more present because not only is this how you operate, but you essentially feel under siege by the kind of broader community. So the only people that are going to understand you are your peers. So you're not going to risk ostracizing them by trying to dial back your behavior. There's a lot of places where we can kind of see this coming in. I think this is one of the things that kind of scares me with a lot of the language that's come out around these two killings. What we've seen is people like Vice President J.D. Vance, but also other Trump administration officials justifying the action, reiterating this kind of narrative of like self-defense, even though anyone who sees these videos, and particularly the Alex Preti video, but I also made another thread that got a lot of traction. I wrote a thing on foreign policy, but I have research ground on vehicle ramming, and I've seen hundreds of vehicle ramming videos, and Rene Good did not intend on striking Ross. But essentially what we're seeing is that this narrative is essentially seeks to frame these actions as self-defense. And then this narrative is kind of quickly reinforced and amplified by like pro-ICE memes and pro-ICE or pro-administration podcasters and commentators and whatnot. And all of that is aimed at reframing or recasting federal action as justified and reframing these protesters or bystanders or observers as dangerous, as domestic terrorists. And this combination of like political endorsement and online affirmation creates this environment where like restraint for the individual ICE agent becomes societally costly. And escalation is societally rewarded as opposed to the restraint and kind of the calm law enforcement approach that would probably be much more optimal in a setting like this.
Yeah. It's so interesting because I think one thing that struck me as you were speaking there is that the narrative that is being established, one of self-defense, one of, just this idea that these protesters are dangerous and the ICE agents are defending themselves or defending society even as a result of that broader media ecosystem that's painting anyone racialized, really, because that's what they're doing. It's not just migrants who have varying levels of immigration status, and none of that would make them inherently violent, but they're really portraying, like, they're constantly a lot of these media figures illustrating and defining and amplifying stories wherein there is a person of color doing something evil. That's why I think they highlighted that story of the stabbing on the bus, for example, by that man who was a person of color who stabbed a white woman. It was clearly a man having some kind of a mental health crisis, but it really became something where they were like framing this as almost a race war. And I think that leads into, you had cited Albert Bandura as arguing that perpetrators kind of preserve a self-image of being a good person while doing harm. And, this is something that's achieved through language. And you later mentioned the role of dehumanization as a result of this cruelty, something I would also argue can be achieved through language too. So I guess I just wanted to ask you if you agree with that premise, what is the role of language here and the portrayal of ICE agents, the way we speak about them and the way we speak about the victims in preserving the self-image of the perpetrators in this modern age of political violence while also, condemning the victims?
Yeah, language does a lot of work here, and it does it often kind of quietly, which is interesting, right? So I think like one of the most common pattern is the use of bureaucratic or technical language. So you're reframing violence as a procedure, as an operation, as an arrest. Detention becomes, unlawful detention becomes processing. People are cases, they're unit, they're threats. So essentially all this type of language is aimed at removing kind of moral weight and replacing it with like a managerial logic. So you're not harming someone, you're doing your job properly. And that feels very different. And another pattern that we see, and I've alluded to this before, is kind of this defensive framing. So harm is seen as prevention or necessary. So the perpetrator is positioning themselves as reacting rather than acting. So phrases like, we had no choice, or this was unavoidable, essentially allows people to see themselves as like restrained and reasonable, even when lethal force is being used, right? And we saw this narrative essentially, and this narrative kind of continues on, particularly with the case of Alex Prenti, where they're talking about how these agents protected themselves. They were approached with somebody with a firearm, but let's not consider the fact that he was, that he had a lawful conceal and carry permit. But or she tried to run him over. All this essential narrative shifts the blame away from the agent of death, if you will, to the victim. And that's extremely important. And that's even more important when it's done at a high level, by an authority figure, by somebody who has a certain gravitas behind their position, or have a huge platform like Truth Social, for example. And then the other thing you talked about, right, is this kind of dehumanization. Talking, rather than talking about individuals and humans and family members, talking about, invaders, criminals, rapists, all of this language that we have kind of seen being used to describe undocumented or undocumented migrants in the United States, does a lot of work at kind of dehumanizing them, and essentially, one, positioning them as a threat, but also positioning them as another. And this isn't unique to this time. This is also used by far right non-state actors and so on. But essentially, what ends up happening here is that individuals disappear and they become a threatening category. And once that happens, the harm starts feeling less like a moral violation and more like risk management. Right? We are doing this because we have to. We have to in order to protect, in the case of Minnesota, we have to do this in order to protect kind of the welfare system against, large scale fraud. We have this in order to protect, young women on the bus from, to use their example, from being stabbed by somebody who's deranged, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially, what ends up happening is that this language, and the other thing that we see is that this language often hardens after violence. And this is one of the things that we see both in the Renee Good and the Pretty killing, right? Where they're not being framed by the administration as bystanders, as civilians, but agitators, protesters, professional protesters. And all of this, all these harsh descriptions allows perpetrators to psychologically justify what they've already done. And hopefully allows the population to kind of excuse it and look away. So essentially, I think it's worth really paying attention to the language that's being used. It's not cosmetic. It's not accidental. It's really, to me, this is the earliest warning sign that these two cases are not going to be isolated incidents unless there's a large reversal of course in the way ICE behaves, and also in the way the administration talks about ICE violence.
Yeah, and I think that's such a scary part, because that's something I'm hearing from so many folks who sort of study this arena, is that this is on a trajectory where it's going to get worse. And it really strikes me that this is a process. Like, getting to this point is a process. That seems to be an overarching sort of theme of this conversation. Is it takes a lot of different factors and different normalizations, peer pressure, specific use of language from authority figures, a level of bureaucratic involvement that makes it more banal to undertake these evil acts. And I guess, maybe this is sort of me asking you just to summarize everything you've already said, but in the specific example of the United States, how long has this process been coming? And what are the factors that have contributed to this dissent, maybe specifically that people might not have recognized, that we can try to pay attention to avoid falling into the same traps? Because I'm sure we've got some of the preconditions here as well. We're so culturally similar to the States. How did this process pick up speed and take place, I guess, and how can we avoid it?
Okay, so as far as this kind of notion of gradualism, I think it's extremely important, right? This didn't happen suddenly, and it didn't happen accidentally. So in the United States, we see that this process building up for decades, right? There's been a slow normalization of security logic and everyday governance. Has been particularly with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, you've seen a large transfer of military weaponry to civilian law enforcement and federal agencies, right? And all of this kind of falls into, what we can kind of look back, and what I'm sure historians that are going to look back at this in 5 years, 10 years, are all going to kind of trace these things as being incidental, or as being incremental to this. The narrative around the war on drug, the post 9/11 war on terror, the framing of like Black Lives Matter protests, discussion about migration, all of these things have a role in bringing us to where we are. So kind of like, how do we start thinking about preventing this, and particularly like within the Canadian context? There's a couple of things, right? Like, Canada is not the United States, and I think it's important that we kind of avoid direct comparison. Like, the legal frameworks are different, the political culture is different, the institutional histories are different, but like at the same time, I think there's often a default settings that Canadians have, which is to see themselves and to understand our history in comparison to that of the United States, and therefore to literally whitewash our history, right? Being like, well, we didn't have slaves, so therefore we're a post-racial state or whatnot. But like, if we actually start looking and talking about the dynamics that I've discussed, these fit very, very well to explain like the colonial violence against Indigenous communities in Canada. If we go back to that question, right, we see the same bureaucratic systems being used to define Indigenous populations as problems historically. That problems that need to be managed rather than as people with autonomy and rights. We've seen policies like forced relocation, residential school systems, suppression of cultural practice, forced sterilizations. All of these were implemented through like procedures and mandates and chains of command that allowed participants in these programs to see themselves as carrying out policies rather than committing harm. So there's a parallel to be made here. And although I don't kind of foresee seeing the same type of like, law enforcement, or if you will, immigration enforcement activities on Canadian streets, and particularly not descending into what we're seeing in the United States, I think there is something particularly dangerous with a society thinking that they are immune and inoculated to state violence, because often state violence doesn't occur where you expect it to be. And this is something I talk to my students about this, and I generally tell them, like, if you were to go back with a time machine in the 1900s, early 1900s, and you found some European intellectuals and you said, in 40 years, there's a European state that's going to mastermind the destruction of 2/3 of European Jews. Guess which state it is? I think people would say it's either Russia or France. They wouldn't say Germany. And yet,
interesting,
this is where it occurred. So I do think it's very, we have to be very careful when we start thinking about kind of state violence and state killing. Because post facto, it's very easy to connect all the dots and essentially trace this narrative that explains how we got there. It's much harder to see it as it is gradually occurring and to put a stop to it.
Yeah. I want to leave a little bit of time for audience questions here, but I have one last thing I really want to ask you, and I don't know if you have like it sucks because it's a big question, but I'm just wondering like if there's any tools that people can equip themselves with, or things that they can practice in their daily lives, or think critically about to try to ensure that they don't become desensitized or become participants or become the ordinary people who are vulnerable to that peer pressure, those, the banality that allows people to become perpetrators of evil. Like, what can individuals do and look out for? And if you can, I don't know, do like a quick answer so that we have time for questions. I'm so sorry because it's such a big question. I feel bad asking you to say it quickly.
I mean, this is cliche because I'm a professor, and I'm just going to say, educate yourself, educate ourselves, have these conversations, right? I think what's useful with this conversation, part of the reason I was excited to talk to you about this, is the recognition that no matter how good of individuals we may think we are, we all have the potential, if the right situation, the right institution, the right structures are present, to do things that we would find otherwise morally abhorrent. So being cognizant of that can end up being a protective factor. Understanding our small roles in creating and perpetuating inequalities and facilitating state violence is extremely important as well. So that would be kind of like, if you want a short answer, self-reflection, I think is probably a really important place to go. Now, at the same time, it's not an easy thing to do, right? All these people we've talked about, the ICE agent, the members of Battalion 101, Eichmann, they were capable of self-reflection, but the institutions around them exercise such an important power. And there's so many of these kind of micro and macro factors I've talked about that were present, that those voices essentially being drowned out or less important in the calculus.
That's so interesting. So basically, folks, look yourself in the mirror, check in with yourself, and be willing to accept the fact that we're not all as smart as we think we are. We're not all as immune to this as we like to imagine. That was what terrified me when I was like researching for this. I was like, damn, you know what? I always assumed that I would stand up, but listening to all of these experiments and how they played out, if it's framed as me needing to do a good job and me like focusing on one technical aspect, I can see how it's easy to be vulnerable to that. And that horrified me. And I think that that's a hard thing to reckon with within yourself, but doing so is a necessary part of changing that within yourself. So, this was a great conversation. I want to leave some time for folks to ask some questions. We have about 10 minutes left. So if you guys have any questions, you can put them in the chat now. And while you do that, Yannick, would you love to tell people where they can keep up with your work? Because I'm sure that after listening to you, like this was such a fascinating conversation, people are probably going to want to follow your stuff. So where can they do that?
Yeah, so on social media, I'm mostly active on Bluesky, although I wouldn't say I'm particularly active. I can be followed there. I sometimes post some insights on LinkedIn as well. I have left the other main social media platform in recent months. In addition, I do. Most of my work is published academic work. So if anybody is not kind of in the university setting and would like to have access to some of the stuff that I've written, don't hesitate to reach out. My RMC email is easily found. Send me an email and tell me what document you're looking for, and I'll be happy to share that with you as well.
Awesome. I've noticed that trend with academics is they always say, reach out to me and I'll send you my paper, because it seems like the world of academic publishing is a bit of a bit of a mess and really expensive. So a lot of people are just willing to send the papers, which is cool.
Well, this is the thing, right? We could do an entire hour on academic publishing, which is another evil. But essentially, we don't make any money on our scholarly work. Right. And at the end of the day, most of us are writing because we have something to say and we want to push the discussion forward. So therefore, making it more accessible is extremely useful.
Totally. Okay, we've got a question in the chat here from Scalpel11. They want to know, please, can you comment on how anti-immigration is always used successfully to increase fascism?
Yeah, so it goes back to this notion of demonization, right? And there's a couple of factors involved here, but essentially having an other is really a good fashion to create this notion of an existential threat, which allows people to go on and to accept different procedures or practices that otherwise they wouldn't be willing to do. So that's one aspect. The other is either present or imaginary, right? And kind of going back to the conversation, the example I was giving earlier about, if I had a time machine, I went back to the 1900s. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is that if you actually look at the distribution of Jews in Europe prior to the Holocaust, there's actually very little in Germany. That's not where they're concentrated. And I do think that is part of the reason. It's one of many, but it is part of the reason that Jewish populations were othered and framed as this existential threat. So that's one of the mechanism that exists here.
Yeah. Forchi wants to know, have you noticed the correlation between brand-obsessed console warriors turning into political ones? So I guess sort of, I mean, I'll let you just take a crack at it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. It's not necessarily something that it's not something that I've looked at very carefully, but I think it goes back to kind of this we live in a climate where it is extremely easy to access information. It's also extremely easy to share information, right? So there is now, this is part of this kind of depth of expertise, right? Everybody can have an opinion. Everybody can proclaim this opinion, and often, particularly with social media platforms, which do a lot of, well, they do some great things, but at the same time, what they do is that they amplify voices of people who ordinarily are essentially just crackpot. And this is something that I've seen particularly with X, and particularly with the monetization of X, and where it really struck me was in the aftermath of October 7th and then the Israeli incursion into Gaza, the amount of OSINT, open source intelligent accounts that propped up and were sharing content that had nothing to do with October 7th or nothing to do with the Israeli incursion into Gaza. It came from Ukraine, it came from places in Africa, it came from previous conflicts, but they're sharing this content as being kind of, the OSINT experts showing this unseen footage before. And the reason is that there's monetization. So it doesn't actually matter whether your content is accurate, as long as your content is either shocking enough to get a huge amount of engagement or controversial enough in order to get that engagement. And I think that's part of the answer. But there's also a lot of amazing work that's being done by some of my colleagues on gaming ecosystem and the dynamics that exist within these, and how some gaming communities can essentially end up being pathways into misogyny, into racism, into Islamophobia, and so on. It's worth, again, doing a quick Google. You'll find a lot of fantastic work that's being done on this topic by people other than me.
Always so humble, eh? You academics, always encouraging us to listen to all kinds of voices. It's probably part of why you're so smart, because you're willing to listen to others. So Canadian wants to know, how do we confront this nonsense without alienating almost all of our families, friends, coworkers?
All right, so there's a psychologist at the University of Sherbrooke. His name is David Morin, and he wrote a fantastic book. I'm not sure if it's been translated into English, but essentially the entire premise of the book is, how do you talk to your aunt or your uncle who's kind of gone down the rabbit hole and is now holding values that are inherently problematic. It's a hard question, and I don't think there's a particular answer. In my experience, I'd say that kind of confronting someone directly with "you are wrong and this is why you are wrong" does not yield very positive result. I think kind of coming from a place of empathy, coming from a place of kind of asking questions and trying to kind of guide people to the realization that the views that they're holding aren't kind of borne out in the facts, or that if you actually kind of look at things objectively, you end up with a very different worldview, can be helpful. At the end of the day, often these are people you care about, right? There's a reason why they're your friends and your family. So having this compassion, I think, can help. At the same time, I'm not saying go hug a Nazi, right? Like that is not what I'm talking about here. But I think when you ostracize people, when you other them, when you essentially say your views are not worth engaging, these people are going to become much more entrenched. And as a result, they're going to seek like-minded people, and there's going to be this echo chamber. We did a paper a couple of years ago where we looked at Women of Stormfront. So Stormfront is this kind of like OG white nationalist website. It's existed since 1996, and we essentially took all the conversations within a sub forum called the Women of Stormfront. And what we found in this paper is that actually very little of the conversations had to do with like ideological stuff. So ideology was like interwoven into the conversation, but a lot of the stuff had to do like with relationship maintenance, with trying to raise families, with household issues and whatnot. And often these women kind of lamented the fact that they didn't have a real life social peer network anymore, that they had been pushed away or ostracized or become estranged from their families and friends because of their white nationalist views. And therefore they needed to ask, the Stormfront was all that was left as far as a way to kind of create social bonds. Now that becomes extremely difficult, right? Because now you're not talking about de-radicalization solely through counter messaging, because you might convince them that, white nationalism is not a great thing. But if that also means losing all their friends, losing all the people they talk to, all the people they interact with, and having no one, then the de-radicalization process becomes way harder. So I don't have a particular answer, but here's some food for thought, I hope.
Yeah, that's something that struck me so much again and again with the extremism reporting I've done is just, anecdotally you hear from people who, I think that's why so many people were radicalized during COVID, as, people might have been initially just vaccine hesitant and, didn't have access to resources. And then they were isolated from their friends and family because their friends and family didn't want to be around them because they were unvaccinated. And then they fell into these communities and that became their only community. So as those communities became increasingly radical and started espousing their white supremacy and they're increasingly, being increasingly blatant with the hateful nature of their content, a lot of these people had no option but to go with it because otherwise they'd be completely alone. And it's a really difficult thing. So Yannick, thank you so much. I'm sorry to the folks in the chat. That's all the time we've got today, but you know where to find Yannick, so you can keep up with his work and, maybe throw a question into his DMs or I don't want to offer you up like that, but if you guys have any, I'm sure that if it's good faith, there's a chance that if he has time, he might answer. If not, just keep up with his work, follow Bubble Pop, and Yannick, thank you again so much for your time today. This was a fantastic and fascinating conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Bubble Pop. I'm Rachel Gilmore, your least favorite person's least favorite journalist. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing on YouTube, Patreon, Substack, or wherever you like to listen. You can also find me on TikTok, Instagram, Twitch, and Bluesky. I'd like to give a special thank you to Hans Vivian Wenzel for making the incredibly groovy music for Bubble Pop. You can find more of his stuff on Spotify under the artist name Hans. That's a lowercase h with an exclamation mark. Thank you again for spending this time with me. This is my dream job. I know I say that every week, but that's because it's true every week, and I couldn't do it for 1 second without your support. So thank you, and I'll see you next time.